June 4th, 1942. The Aleutian Islands, a place where the Pacific wind cuts through your bones and the fog can swallow an entire squadron in seconds. Most Americans had never heard of these remote islands stretching between Alaska and Japan, but on that morning, they became the stage for one of the most consequential accidents in military history. A single mechanical failure, a pilot's desperate decision, and an intact aircraft would hand the United States a secret that Japan had guarded fiercely since the attack on Pearl Harbor. This is the story of how Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga unintentionally changed the course of the Pacific War. If you're fascinated by untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Your support helps us bring more incredible historical narratives to light. The morning sun barely penetrated the thick clouds rolling over Akutan Island as Koga performed his pre-flight inspection. His hands moved with practiced efficiency over the smooth metal skin of his Zero fighter, checking control surfaces, examining the engine cowling, testing the responsiveness of the ailerons. The A6M2 Model 21-0 was Japan's premier fighter aircraft, a machine that had dominated the skies over Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and throughout the Pacific theater. Lightweight, maneuverable, with a range that seemed impossible to American strategists, the Zero had become a symbol of Japanese air superiority, and its secrets were meant to remain exactly that, secrets. Koga was 24 years old, a veteran pilot despite his youth. He had trained for years at Tsuchiura Air Group, learning not just to fly, but to think like his aircraft, to feel every vibration, every shift in air pressure. His instructors had been merciless, demanding perfection, because anything less meant death. In the Zero's cockpit, there was no armor plating to protect the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks to prevent fires. The aircraft had been designed with a singular philosophy: offense over defense, speed and maneuverability over survivability. Japanese military doctrine assumed that a skilled pilot would simply avoid being hit. Koga had internalized this belief completely. The mission briefing had been straightforward. Their squadron would escort bombers attacking the American base at Dutch Harbor, part of a larger operation designed to draw the American fleet north, while the main Japanese force engaged at Midway. Koga listened to his commander outline the route, the timing, the expected resistance. Intelligence suggested the Americans had relocated their fighters, but they should still expect anti-aircraft fire. The weather would be challenging, visibility poor, but that was normal for the Aleutians. Everything about these islands was harsh, unforgiving. As his Zero lifted off from the carrier Rujo, Koga felt the familiar surge of adrenaline mixed with focus. The 18-cylinder Nakajima Sakai engine roared smoothly, pulling him skyward. Around him, his squadron mates formed up, their aircraft moving like birds in synchronized flight. Below, the gray Pacific churned with whitecaps. The cloud cover was even worse than anticipated, forcing them to navigate largely by compass and instinct. This was the kind of flying that separated good pilots from dead ones. The attack on Dutch Harbor unfolded in chaos. American P-40 Warhawks rose to meet them, and the sky filled with tracer fire and smoke. Koga dove into the fray, his Zero responding instantly to every input. He fired at an American fighter that crossed his path, saw his round strike home, watched the enemy aircraft trailing smoke as it descended. But then he felt it, a sharp impact, a shudder that ran through his entire aircraft. Something had hit him. He scanned his instruments frantically. Oil pressure was dropping. Coolant temperature was rising. One of the American gunners, either from a fighter or from the anti-aircraft batteries below, had scored a hit on his engine. The Zero was losing power. Koga could feel it in the way the stick responded, in the way the engine note changed from a roar to a rough, struggling rhythm. He radioed his flight leader, keeping his voice calm despite the ice forming in his stomach. Engine damaged, oil pressure critical, attempting to return to base. His leader acknowledged, but they both knew the mathematics. The carrier was over 600 miles away. With a damaged engine, that distance might as well have been across an ocean. Koga's training took over. First priority, maintain altitude as long as possible. Second priority, identify potential landing sites. Third priority, if forced to abandon the aircraft, destroy it to prevent capture. That last order had been drilled into every Zero pilot from their first day of training. The Americans must never get their hands on an intact Zero. The aircraft's capabilities, its strengths and weaknesses, were among Japan's most closely guarded military secrets. He scanned the islands below, looking for anything flat enough to attempt an emergency landing. The Aleutians were not generous. Volcanic peaks, rocky shores, dense vegetation. But then he saw it, Akutan Island, with what appeared to be a gently sloping meadow near the coast. The grass looked thick, and even from altitude, almost inviting. His engine was making terrible sounds now, metal grinding on metal, the oil pressure gauge reading nearly 0. He had minutes at best before catastrophic failure. Koga made his decision. He would attempt a wheels-up landing in that meadow. If he could set the Zero down gently enough, he might walk away from it. Then he would set demolition charges and ensure the aircraft was destroyed before making his way to a rendezvous point for submarine pickup. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot he had. He called in his position to his flight leader one last time, then focused entirely on the landing approach. The wind was stronger than he had anticipated, gusting across the island from the northeast. He adjusted his angle, bleeding off speed, fighting to keep the nose level. The meadow rushed up to meet him. At the last moment, he realized his terrible mistake. What had looked like solid grass from altitude was actually a bog, a wetland thick with moss and standing water. But by then, it was too late to pull up. The Zero's belly hit the soft ground, and the aircraft flipped instantly, violently. Koga felt himself thrown forward against his harness, then sideways as the world spun. Metal screamed, the canopy shattered, and then everything was still. When the spinning stopped, Koga found himself hanging upside down in his harness, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead into his eyes. The aircraft was inverted, its landing gear pointing skyward, its propeller buried in the bog. He struggled with his harness release, his hands clumsy with shock and injury. The smell of aviation fuel filled his nose, sharp and dangerous. He needed to get out. He needed to set the demolition charges. But his neck hurt in a way that made breathing difficult. When he tried to move his legs, they did not respond properly. Something was very wrong. He reached up, or rather down since he was inverted, trying to find purchase to pull himself free. His hand touched water. The bog was already seeping into the cockpit. Koga's last thoughts were of his family in Iwakuni, of his younger brother who had also joined the Naval Air Service, of his mother who had made him promise to return safely. He thought about the Zero beneath him, this magnificent machine that was supposed to be invincible. He thought about the mission, about duty, about honor, and then he thought nothing at all. The impact had fractured his cervical vertebrae. Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga died alone in his cockpit, suspended upside down in a bog on a remote Aleutian island, his aircraft intact around him. For 5 weeks, the Zero sat undisturbed. The Japanese knew approximately where Koga had gone down, but recovering a downed aircraft from the Aleutians was deemed too risky. They assumed correctly that Koga was dead. They assumed, incorrectly, that the aircraft would have been destroyed in the crash, or that Koga would have successfully demolished it before dying. This assumption would prove catastrophic. On July 10, 1942, a U.S. Navy patrol plane spotted something unusual on Akutan Island. The pilot, Lieutenant William Thies, saw what appeared to be an intact aircraft sitting upside down in a meadow. He circled lower, trying to identify it through the persistent fog. When he recognized the distinctive shape of a Zero fighter, he could barely believe his eyes. He immediately radioed the discovery to Dutch Harbor. The response was swift. Within days, a recovery team landed on Akutan Island. Chief Petty Officer William Rawle led the team through the difficult terrain to the crash site. What they found exceeded their wildest hopes. The Zero was damaged, but structurally intact. The engine, while damaged from the crash, was complete. The cockpit instruments were readable. The control systems were intact. And inside the cockpit, they found the body of Tadayoshi Koga, still strapped into his seat. Rawle ordered his team to treat the pilot's remains with respect. They carefully removed Koga's body from the aircraft and buried him nearby with military honors, marking the grave. It was a small gesture, but these men understood that Koga had been a warrior like themselves, killed in service to his country. The circumstances that had brought them to this remote island were matters of politics and strategy far above their pay grade, but respect for a fellow serviceman, that was universal. The recovery itself was an engineering challenge that bordered on the impossible. The Zero weighed over 2 tons and was sitting in the middle of a bog, accessible only by a narrow, treacherous path from the beach. Rawle and his team constructed a makeshift road using timber and matting, slowly, painstakingly, dragging the inverted aircraft toward the shore. Every foot of progress required hours of work. The weather refused to cooperate, alternating between fog, rain, and wind that threatened to destroy their carefully constructed pathway. After 3 weeks of brutal labor, they managed to get the Zero to the beach and load it onto a barge. From there, it was transported to Dutch Harbor and then shipped to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego. The Zero had begun its journey into American hands, and with it, the secrets of Japanese air superiority. Lieutenant Commander Eddie R. Sanders was assigned to lead the technical evaluation team. Sanders was a test pilot and engineer, a man who understood aircraft at a fundamental level. When he first saw the captured Zero, his reaction was mixed fascination and respect. The aircraft was smaller than he had expected, almost delicate looking. The construction was elegant, with attention to weight savings evident in every component. But as he examined it more closely, he also began to see the compromises, the choices that Japanese designers had made to achieve the Zero's remarkable performance. The team spent weeks carefully documenting every aspect of the aircraft before attempting to restore it to flying condition. They measured the wing loading, examined the control surfaces, studied the engine design, analyzed the fuel system. Every discovery was documented, photographed, and reported up the chain of command. What emerged was a complete technical profile of Japan's premier fighter. The Zero's strengths were immediately apparent. The aircraft had an incredibly low wing loading, meaning it had large wing area relative to its weight. This gave it phenomenal maneuverability, particularly at low speeds. American pilots had reported that the Zero could outturn any aircraft in the U.S. inventory, and now Sanders understood why. The aircraft also had remarkable range, achieved through large fuel tanks and an efficient engine. A Zero could fly escort missions that would be impossible for American fighters. But the weaknesses were equally revealing. The lack of pilot armor and self-sealing fuel tanks meant that the Zero was extremely vulnerable to gunfire. A few well-placed rounds could set the entire aircraft ablaze or kill the pilot instantly. The engine, while efficient, was not particularly powerful, meaning the Zero's performance degraded at high altitudes. And perhaps most critically, the aircraft had poor high-speed characteristics. At speeds above 300 miles per hour, the controls became heavy and unresponsive. The Zero could outturn an American fighter, but it could not outdive one. By September 1942, Sanders and his team had the Zero in flying condition. The test flights began carefully, with Sanders treating the aircraft with appropriate respect. He was flying a machine that had killed hundreds of American servicemen, and he was acutely aware that any mistake could be his last. But as he put the Zero through its paces, he began to understand not just its capabilities, but how to fight it. The intelligence gathered from Koga's Zero was immediately distributed throughout the American military. Fighter tactics were revised based on the new understanding of the Zero's strengths and weaknesses. American pilots were instructed to avoid turning dogfights with Zeros, to use their superior high-speed performance and diving ability to make slashing attacks and escape before the Zero could bring its maneuverability to bear. They were taught to target the Zero's vulnerable fuel tanks, to exploit its poor armor protection. The impact was immediate and measurable. American fighter kill ratios against the Zero began to improve dramatically. Pilots who understood the enemy aircraft's limitations could engage it effectively. The mystique of Japanese air superiority began to crumble. Commander James Flatley, a fighter squadron leader, had the opportunity to fly against the captured Zero in a mock combat scenario. He took up a F-6F Hellcat, the newest American carrier fighter, and engaged in a series of dogfights with Sanders and the Zero. The lessons learned were invaluable. Flatley discovered that by maintaining high speed and using boom and zoom tactics, the Hellcat could consistently defeat the Zero despite the Japanese fighter's superior turning ability. These tactics were quickly incorporated into combat training programs throughout the Pacific Fleet. At the Grumman Aircraft Factory, engineers studied detailed reports on the Zero's performance characteristics. This intelligence directly influenced the final development of the F-6F Hellcat, ensuring it had the power and high-speed performance needed to counter the Zero effectively. The Hellcat would go on to achieve an astonishing kill ratio of 19-1 against Japanese aircraft, becoming the most successful carrier fighter of the war. The story of Koga's Zero remained classified throughout the war. Japanese intelligence never learned that the Americans had recovered an intact aircraft. Japanese commanders could not understand why their previously dominant fighter was suddenly being defeated with such regularity. They attributed it to improved American pilot training, better tactics, or new aircraft designs. They never suspected that their enemy had been able to study their premier fighter in exquisite detail. After the war ended, the full story began to emerge. American military historians recognized the capture of Koga's Zero as one of the most significant intelligence coups of the Pacific War. Some analysts argued that the intelligence gained from this single aircraft shortened the war by months, perhaps even a year, saving countless lives on both sides. The Zero itself remained at Naval Air Station North Island until 1945, when it was flown cross-country to Norfolk, Virginia, and then to the Smithsonian Institution for Permanent Preservation. But over the decades, the aircraft's condition deteriorated. By the 1970s, it required extensive restoration. The work was painstaking, with specialists carefully preserving as much original material as possible while ensuring the aircraft's structural integrity. Today, Koga's Zero resides at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum's Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center in Virginia. It sits in a place of honor, one of the most significant aircraft of World War II, a testament to the role that chance, courage, and engineering can play in determining the outcome of conflicts. In Japan, Tadayoshi Koga's fate remained unknown to his family for years. After the war, through the efforts of military historians and diplomats, his remains were eventually recovered from Akutan Island and returned to Japan for proper burial. His family learned that he had died not in dramatic aerial combat, but in a landing accident. his body discovered by the same Americans who would use his aircraft to defeat Japanese forces throughout the Pacific. It was a bitter irony that his final unintended contribution to the war effort benefited the enemy rather than his own nation. The story raises profound questions about the nature of warfare, about the thin line between victory and defeat, about how the smallest decisions can have enormous consequences. If Koga had chosen to ditch in the ocean rather than attempt a landing, the Zero would have sunk and been lost forever. If the crash had been more severe, the aircraft would have been too damaged to provide useful intelligence. If Koga had survived long enough to set his demolition charges, the Americans would have found only wreckage. Any of these outcomes would have changed the course of the Pacific Air War. Some Japanese historians have argued that overconfidence in the Zero's invincibility contributed to Japanese losses. The aircraft's early dominance led to a belief that superior spirit and training could overcome any material disadvantage. This philosophy, combined with Japan's industrial limitations, meant that new fighter designs that could counter improved American aircraft were developed too slowly. By the time Japan fielded fighters with armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks, the Americans had already gained air superiority throughout the Pacific. American pilots who flew against the Zero in the later stages of the war had a different perspective. Many expressed respect for the aircraft and its pilots, even as they exploited its weaknesses. They understood that the men flying Zeros were skilled, brave warriors fighting for their country with the tools they had been given. The fact that American intelligence had compromised those tools did not diminish the courage required to fly them into combat. The capture of Koga's Zero represents a unique moment in military history where a single accident had strategic consequences. In an era before satellite reconnaissance, before detailed technical intelligence sharing, before computer simulations, the only way to truly understand an enemy aircraft was to capture and test it. The Americans had tried desperately to recover an intact Zero since the beginning of the war. Japanese security measures had been effective in preventing this, until a damaged oil line, a pilot's desperate decision, and a deceptive meadow combined to hand the Americans exactly what they needed. The technical intelligence gathered from Koga's aircraft influenced not just tactics, but strategy. American naval commanders, understanding the Zero's range limitations and vulnerability, could plan operations with greater confidence. Aircraft designers could develop counters to specific Japanese capabilities. Training programs could be optimized to exploit known weaknesses. The fog of war, never fully dispelled, became at least partially clearer. For the men who recovered and studied the Zero, it remained a source of professional pride throughout their lives. They had been part of something significant, something that had materially affected the outcome of the war. Chief Petty Officer Rahl, who led the recovery team, kept photographs of the operation and would occasionally speak about it in his later years, always emphasizing the difficulty of the work and the respect they had shown to the Japanese pilots' remains. Lieutenant Commander Sanders, who test flew the captured Zero, went on to a distinguished career in naval aviation. He never forgot the experience of flying an enemy aircraft, of understanding firsthand what American pilots were facing in combat. In his retirement, he wrote a detailed technical report about the experience, contributing to the historical record and ensuring that future generations of engineers and pilots could learn from this unique intelligence opportunity. The story of Tadayoshi Koga and his Zero is ultimately a human story about the randomness of war, about how individual actions can have consequences far beyond their intent. Koga was doing his duty, trying to save himself and his aircraft. His death was not heroic in the traditional sense, not a dramatic sacrifice, but a simple accident, a mechanical failure followed by a fatal error in judgment about a landing site. Yet this accident became one of the most important events in the Pacific Air War. In the broader context of World War II, the capture of Koga's Zero represents the kind of advantage that intelligence, whether gained through cryptography, espionage, or sheer luck, could provide. The Japanese never knew their premier fighter had been compromised. They continued to rely on tactics and strategies that American pilots and commanders could now counter effectively. This information asymmetry contributed to the rapid shift in the balance of air power in the Pacific. The lessons from this incident extended beyond World War II. Modern military forces understand the critical importance of protecting sensitive technology, of ensuring that advanced systems do not fall into enemy hands. Aircraft are designed with self-destruct mechanisms. Pilots are trained extensively on security protocols. The hard lesson learned from Koga's Zero, that a single captured example can compromise an entire weapon system, has influenced military security practices for generations. For aviation enthusiasts and historians, Koga's Zero remains an object of endless fascination. The aircraft in the Smithsonian represents not just a significant military artifact, but a connection to a specific moment in time, to the men who flew it, fought against it, recovered it, and studied it. Visitors who stand before the restored Zero can see the actual machine that changed the course of the Pacific War. can observe the elegant simplicity of its design, can imagine the young pilot who flew it on his final mission. The story serves as a reminder that in war, as in life, outcomes often hinge on factors beyond anyone's control. Koga could not have known that his oil line would fail. He could not have known that what appeared to be a suitable landing site was actually a bog. He could not have known that his aircraft would remain intact enough to provide the Americans with a complete technical analysis. These accidents of fate combined to create a moment that changed history. In Japanese military culture, where honor and sacrifice were paramount, Koga's unintended contribution to the enemy war effort might have been seen as a source of shame. But modern Japanese historians have taken a more nuanced view. They recognize that Koga was a skilled pilot who made a reasonable decision under impossible circumstances. The responsibility for the security breach lies not with him, but with the design choices that left Japanese pilots with so few options when their aircraft were damaged, and with the strategic overextension that led to operations in the Aleutians where recovery of downed aircraft was nearly impossible. American victory in the Pacific resulted from many factors: industrial capacity, code-breaking intelligence, strategic decisions, and the courage and skill of millions of servicemen. The contribution of a single captured aircraft should not be overstated, but neither should it be dismissed. In a war where technological and tactical advantages could mean the difference between survival and annihilation for fighter pilots, the intelligence from Koga's Zero saved American lives and hastened victory. As we reflect on this chapter of history from the distance of decades, what stands out is not just the military significance, but the human elements. A young pilot far from home, making a split-second decision that would have consequences he never imagined. American sailors showing respect for an enemy's remains while securing an intelligence prize. Engineers and test pilots working to understand a foreign aircraft, not out of idle curiosity, but to save the lives of their comrades. These are the threads that weave together to create history. The Zero that sits in the Smithsonian today is more than metal and fabric. It is a monument to Tadayoshi Koga, a testament to the men who fought and died on all sides of the Pacific War, and a reminder of how the smallest accidents can have the largest consequences. It represents a moment when chance, circumstance, and human decision intersected to alter the course of events, when one man's final flight became an unintended gift to his enemies and a turning point in the deadliest conflict in human history.